Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Asaf Weiss, and I serve as the Vice President of the American Jewish Congress. It is my privilege to moderate today's webinar together with the World Zionist Organization. Today, we are deeply honored to host former Mayor of Pittsburgh, Bill Peduto, who led his city through with courage, compassion, and moral clarity during one of the darkest moments in American Jewish history. Just 2 days ago, we marked 7 years since the horrific anti-Semitic attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 innocent people were murdered simply for being Jewish. It was the deadliest anti-Semitic assault in the history of the United States, and its echoes are felt still today. This conversation is not only about remembrance, it's also about responsibility. Mayors and local leaders everywhere hold the power and the duty to ensure that every community feels safe and that anti-Semitism, racism, and hate have no place in their cities. We will have time for your questions at the end of this discussion, so please submit them in the chat box just below the screen. You can see their Q&A and you can write your questions and we will address them afterwards. Before we begin, I invite you all to follow us on social media and to subscribe for our mailing list. Links are included in the email that you've received. We will start with an opening remarks by Daniel Rosen and Tova Dorfman, and then we will hear from our main speaker, Mayor Peduto. Now, it is my honor to introduce the President of the American Jewish Congress, Daniel Rosen, whose leadership continues to guide our efforts to fight hate in all its forms, support Israel, and stand for the Jewish people in the US and worldwide. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Asaf, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's executive briefing hosted by the American Jewish Congress. We are grateful to have with us Tova Dorfman, the president of the World Zionist Organization, who is a close partner in our shared mission. We are honored today to be joined by our dear friend, Mayor Bill Peduto, who led the city of Pittsburgh with strength, compassion, and dignity during one of the darkest moments in American Jewish history. Just 2 days ago, we marked 7 years since the horrific anti-Semitic attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue, which claimed the lives of 11 innocent people. Today, anti-Semitism walks openly in the streets, unmasked, unashamed, and often encouraged. Since October 7th, we have witnessed a terrifying surge in hate against Jews, not just online, but in our neighborhoods, schools, and public spaces. We now see anti-Semitic attacks almost daily across the United States and the world. Mayor Peduto's leadership in the aftermath of the Tree of Life massacre showed what moral courage looks like. He stood with his city, with his Jewish community, and with the global Jewish people, not just in words, but in action. I also want to note that shortly after the terrible tragedy, Mayor Peduto joined our International Mayors Conference in 2019, an act of solidarity that deeply moved us all and demonstrated his steadfast support for Jewish communities worldwide. As we gather today, we are reminded that mayors and local leaders have a unique and vital role to play. They hold the responsibility and the power to ensure the safety of all communities in their cities and to stand firmly against anti-Semitism and hate in every form. Mayor Peduto, thank you for being here, for your leadership, for leading by example, and for your unwavering friendship.
Thank you so much, Dan. Now, it is my privilege to introduce Tova Dorfman, president of the World Zionist Organization and a tireless advocate for the Jewish unity and identity. Tova, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Asaf. Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here with Mayor Peduto. We are extremely concerned with what is happening around the world, obviously, as the World Zionist Organization, which was founded by Theodore Herzl in 1897, as the start of the national liberation movement for the Jewish people. Was in the creation of a state in 1948. I have to say that we are working very tirelessly about dealing with issues of anti-Semitism, which have been disguised under the terms of anti-Zionism. And I want to be very clear that anti-Zionism is basically anti-Semitism. It calls into question the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And I want everybody to be aware that if they hear those terms, it really is interchangeable. And we've been working very hard to figure out different ways of being able to combat those all these syndromes that are happening, especially in partnership with the American Jewish Congress and other organizations. We are happy to join forces and help cities wherever there is a need. So I am honored to be here today, and I thank you for your leadership, Mayor Peduto, in one of the most difficult moments, I would say, in Jewish history in America. So thank you, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Tova. Now, it is my great honor to introduce Mayor Bill Peduto. As mayor of Pittsburgh, he led his city through unimaginable tragedy with courage, compassion, and moral clarity following the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre. His leadership became a symbol of unity and moral strength, and his continued friendship with the Jewish people in Israel, including his participation in the American Jewish Congress International Mayors Conference in 2019, stands as a testament to his enduring commitment to fighting hate and building safer, stronger communities for all. Thank you very much, Mayor Peduto, for joining us.
Thank you, Asaf. And Daniel and Tova, thank you for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be able to work with you, not only during this difficult time and during the time when Pittsburgh needed help, but hopefully in future times when there is a shared prosperity. It was almost 10 a.m. and I had the day off. I don't get many days off. Mayors never really have a day off, but I had a Saturday morning where I could simply recharge, and that's what I planned to do. I wanted to sleep in and have a rainy, cold October Saturday to myself, and I got a call, and I didn't pick it up. I looked over, and it was my chief of staff, Dan Gilman, and I let the phone ring. And we had a system where if something was needed to be dealt with immediately, that he always knew to call back a second time and I would pick up. And I noticed the phone immediately rang a second time. So I picked up the phone. I'm not sure of the exact words, what he said, but I do remember him saying, Tree of Life, active shooter, multiple casualties, officers down. And I took that in and immediately said to him, let me call you back in 1 minute. And I hung up the phone and I said a prayer and I just prayed for guidance. And I called him back probably 30 seconds later. And I said, can you come down and get me? And he said, I'm already on the way. Now, I live 5 blocks from Tree of Life. Dan lives even closer. And so it only took a minute or so before his car was outside. I just grabbed a coat, put on a baseball hat, jumped in the car, and we arrived at the synagogue before SWAT. We were there and standing outside foolishly within the line of shot of the murderer, who at that point was on the 3rd floor. And as the first police officers began arriving, they immediately pulled us away and put us into a side street. And we waited. The rain would gather on the leaves and drop down into big drops. And as we sat there, word started coming out about what had actually happened and what was happening within the synagogue itself. My public safety director wasn't there at the time. He was about 100 miles away. The police chief hadn't yet arrived, and I was in the process of going through as higher ranking officials would arrive through law enforcement, of putting them in charge and then the next one in charge, until the point that the public safety director, who drove 120 miles an hour down the Pennsylvania Turnpike, was on the scene. We never really thought about it because we were never in the situation, but even our public information officer who had one cell phone and was sitting there texting to make sure that we knew what was going on minute by minute until the phone had become completely waterlogged and we lost communication. We went out and we wanted to make sure that every synagogue in the city knew to lock their doors. So we immediately called and went through a phone list of each of our synagogues, not recognizing that it was Shabbat. And in many of those locations, they wouldn't pick up the phone. So we sent out officers to each of those locations, and we put armed guards in front of each of our synagogues. And one by one, local municipalities started to pour in order to be able to be there on the site. And as the time went from minutes to the first hour, law enforcement from surrounding counties started arriving. I watched as a state trooper from Westmoreland County put on his gear and got ready to enter into that building knowing that there was an active shooter there. But it wasn't just the law enforcement that was there. As we sat in this side street, and because it was right before Election Day, Governor Wolf was there. Then Attorney General Josh Shapiro was there. Senator Terzai, Speaker of the House Terzai was there from Pennsylvania State Legislature. Senator Toomey was there. Senator Casey was there. A gathering of elected officials, all were present on the scene, Democrat and Republican. But across the street, I noticed Wazi Muhammad. Wazi was a friend of mine, and he was the executive director of the Islamic Center. And I walked over and I gave him a hug. And I said, "Why are you here?" And Wazi looked at me and he said, "We were having our executive board meeting. We're all here." And the entire executive board of the Islamic Center was there. And he said, "We had to be here for our neighbors." And I went up and I thanked each of them. And what was important to understand was it wasn't that they were there simply because of this one act. After September 11th, the United Jewish Federation of Pittsburgh visited the Islamic Center, and they presented their neighbors with an American flag, and they told them that they were there for them. The Islamic Center in the Muslim community made sure that no family had to pay any expense in the burial of their loved ones. The entire funeral costs of all 11 of our neighbors was paid by the Muslim community. As the day went on and as the perpetrator was arrested and taken out of that building, there was a numbness that was beyond anything that I had experienced. And as I went to visit the survivors in the hospital, I remember very clearly going up the hill of Mercy Hospital and hearing on NPR the words, "The worst act of violence, the worst act of anti-Semitic violence in American history." And recognizing that Pittsburgh had now become one of those places like Dallas and Memphis. And recognizing too that these weren't just neighbors, but these were people who I knew, people who were friends. My chief of staff, Dan Gilman, lost the brothers of his mother-in-law. His parents lost their two best friends. Of the victims, 5 of them were people who I knew. And that's not uncommon because Pittsburgh is a small community. We literally live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Fred Rogers grew up right down the street, or not grew up, lived right down the street from Tree of Life. And in a community like Squirrel Hill, it's not only one of the strongest urban Jewish communities in the United States. But the fact is that not only did most of the people know each other, but many of them were related to each other. What made me proud about Pittsburgh began within the first few hours. The FBI was already preparing to create the emergency center where families could find out if their family member was a victim. But before the FBI could even get it started, the United Jewish Federation and its other agencies had already created it at the JCC. And not only did they have it up and running, but they had counselors and they had others to be able to help people. And people gathered, not only those that thought that they may have a family member who was a victim, but people who just wanted to be there because they had friends who thought they might have a family member who was a victim. That level of compassion was a light that I would see over the next week. And when I say a light, I mean a visible light, that in the darkest time, you will be able to find that light. And again, it's in those words of Mr. Rogers, in times of crisis, look for the helpers. And the helpers were abound. Only a few hours after the situation was in the process of going from active shooter to doing the investigation, it was students, high school students, who had already begun the preparation for a memorial service that evening. And they chose a Protestant church in the heart of the Squirrel Hill community to gather. I arrived there after being able to visit with some of the families and really just put myself in the back of the church and watched as the community began a self-healing process. And I was shocked that there was not a space available. When I say that, I don't mean that every pew was filled. I mean every inch of the floor was filled. And it wasn't until the service ended that I really understood how Pittsburgh has a heart of compassion. Because I walked out the door, in the entire intersection going 2-3 blocks down was filled with Pittsburghers. I saw the mother of an ex-girlfriend who came in from the suburbs, who had no connection whatsoever, but she knew she had to be there. And that was multiplied. People walked over 2 miles, parking their cars so that they could be there. And there was a message that was very clear. In Pittsburgh, an attack against one is an attack against all. And we believe that in our sports, but we also believe that in our humanity, in the people who call themselves Pittsburghers. We learned a lesson that day, that words matter, and that words about communities that are giving. Dor Hadash was very giving in helping the refugees and the migrants who moved to Pittsburgh to be able to find jobs and to be able to find housing and to be able to start a new life, no matter what their religion or how they praise God or if they even did. And because of that, Tree of Life was targeted. And we understood something else, that there is only one way to be able to attack hate, and that's through love. And that we would work together as one community from all faiths or no faiths, and be able to say never again means never again. And we had a North Star, and that North Star was first directed to the families, so that when a family requested, that a major street in the city of Pittsburgh be shut down because they didn't feel safe having it open. And public safety said, we need that street in order for ambulances to get to hospitals just blocks away. Our North Star said, we listened to the family first. And when we recognized that those in the hospitals needed time to heal, we recognized that they became the next priority. And then when we recognized that this was a targeted attack against one group, that group became a priority. And then we also realized that we had to do more than just get by. We had to heal. And healing became that priority. I remember visiting Hillel and also going down the street and visiting one of the schools. And when I was there at the yeshiva, I was leaving the building and walking up the street, and a car stopped. It was a minivan, and it backed up, and I was with a police officer. And when we were at the yeshiva, I had several police officers there, and I wanted the kids to know this is okay. The bad guy's in jail. He's never coming out. And I wanted them to know that these officers are here to make sure that everything's okay. Trauma has a way of affecting people at a very young age, and just seeing a police officer at your school can be traumatizing. But that minivan backed up. The officer with me immediately put his hand on his gun, and out came a kid, probably 8th grade, and he had a vase, a glass vase with a rose in it, and he handed it to me. And I said, "What's this?" And he simply said, "You're my neighbor, and we love you." And it wasn't because I was the mayor. And I went up to the car and I looked in, and his mom was driving, and the entire front seat was filled with vases with roses. And I don't even know if they lived in the neighborhood. They were just driving, handing random people flowers. And that rose and that vase sat outside the door of the mayor's office with the Israeli flag and a candle for 2 weeks. And that's that light that I'm talking about. That's how you get by in these difficult times. But there's another level that's needed. While I was mayor, I looked for an organization to try and help us to be able to heal. And I found that an organization through the Strong Cities Network, an organization globally that addresses hate, extremism, and polarization on both sides, and works to be able to find new ways to deal with it outside of law enforcement and through a public health model. And through Strong Cities Network, we implemented multiple opportunities of bringing faiths together, of bringing different stakeholders together that usually wouldn't sit around that same table. And through Strong Cities Network now, we are working and have created the North American hub in Pittsburgh. We've created the Prevention Academy, working with 8 cities a year and creating a 1-year program where they can actually get a strong initiative completed. And that type of a network needs to work not only locally, but globally, and to be connected in ways that we address hate in all of its forms. And what's interesting about a city like Pittsburgh is that we are in a flex. We in Northern Appalachia have a chance of being left behind in a new economy. It is very similar to areas like in Eastern Germany and in areas in post-industrial UK. And so we've been working together in transatlantic post-industrial regions where economic uncertainty increases the likelihood of hate, extremism, and polarization. And putting together programs in these areas that not only look at how we can upskill workforce and create innovation zones, but how we also can create opportunities to prevent hate to exist. These opportunities are necessities, and they are critical to the continuation of democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. And when we look at it as it is at this moment, the prevalence of anti-Semitism in these areas has risen significantly, and it can only be addressed through proactive measures. So I ask you, what are you doing at your local level? Because that's where it matters. And if you are in an area that has economic uncertainty, how are you working to address it in a way that will benefit all, but will also recognize that with economic uncertainty comes hate, and recognize that in many of those areas, that hate will be directly targeted to the Jewish community. So I don't want to take this entire time just to tell you about what happened on that horrific day, or to tell you the lessons learned or these proactive ways that we can address it. I want to be able to have an interactive discussion with you. So I'll turn it back to you, Asaf, and hopefully have an opportunity to have a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Mayor Peduto, for these very important, fascinating words. Hearing back your story about 7 years ago, we hear about all the efforts and everything that you've done to lead your community, your city through this very, very, very tragic time. Can you share with us? You spoke about the responsibility of each of us for our local communities, and also about the responsibility for mayors who are leading cities and leading large communities, and have to make sure that those locations and places are safe for everyone. Can you share with us, what do you feel from all of the things that you've described and shared and told us? What do you feel was the most important thing that you've done to lead your community throughout this challenge?
The immediate reaction when something hits hard, so close to home, is the fight or flight, and it's to punch back. Immediately, I wanted to yell about the words that were being spoken. At that moment, it was coming up to the election, and there was a lot of discussion around migrants who were coming onto the American southern border, and they were being characterized as invaders. Those were the words that got the shooter enraged in his postings on social media and his action at the Tree of Life. And those words were careless and hurtful in order to be able to obtain votes for an election. As an elected official, you should never even consider such actions, number one. Number two, in the response to an act of hate, the only true way to heal is by going in the opposite direction. I think Martin Luther King said it, and I can't remember the quote directly, but darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can. And it's probably one of the most difficult things to do, is to be able to try and communicate a message of love when your natural reaction is the opposite. So you have to, as an elected official, pull your community together. You have to be able to have everyone have an empathy to be able to feel what the victims are feeling. And in this case, the victim was the entire Jewish community. When we held a gathering 2 weeks later after the funerals, and we did it at the point where the Allegheny and the Monongahela flow to form the Ohio River. At that sacred spot, we had every community represented. It wasn't that we had a Jewish ceremony. The lead speaker was from the Native American nations, and all faiths were there. But so were the Steelers and the Pirates and the Penguins. So were the community leaders and others. Michael Keaton came back to MC it. Tom Hanks, who had just portrayed Mr. Rogers in a film, sang It's a Wonderful Day in the Neighborhood with Fred Rogers' widow. What we experienced was the sense of community, and that can't be manufactured. And that's really the key takeaway for mayors, is if you're not doing it now, when the time comes when it's needed, it won't be there. The fact is that Pittsburgh has a very strong interfaith community, and it has had it for over 20 years. In the time when it was absolutely necessary to be able to help us all get through it, it was there to be present. And it's through small actions. It's about, like, I'll use the example of the Pittsburgh Penguins, who took over an old armory and turned it into a skating rink. And because it has two churches right next to it, one Catholic, one Episcopalian, invited them both to be a part of it, but then realized that they should be inviting the Baptist church down the street, Rodef Shalom, and the Islamic Center, and brought all of those children together for a free day of skating. That interaction by an organization that runs a hockey team is the type of community building that mayors need to amplify. A city government isn't big enough or strong enough to be able to do all those types of activities, but just like the conductor of an orchestra, a mayor has the ability to amplify those efforts of bringing people together. As we see this almost impossible ability to have dialogue between religions today, it is critical for mayors to find ways to be able to bring people back to a table, to sit, to talk, and to get to know one another.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to tell everyone, we're getting your questions in the chat and we're reading them. You can, if anyone didn't submit his question, you can still submit them, and we'll be happy to ask Mayor Peduto. Mayor, in the 2 years ago, since October 7, we've seen a dramatic rise in antisemitism worldwide. What worries you the most in this new reality?
Well, it's amplified again through what I'm saying, but it's happening in the division of people across the board: politics, race, religion, it doesn't matter. Social media and the internet are basically programmed in order to be able to create chaos and hate. And it not only is coming from international actors, but also domestically. And it is creating, unfortunately, with an entire generation of younger people, this false reality of how it's us versus them. No matter what the issue is, it's 100% us versus them. And when you look at what is happening in Gaza and the anti-Semitism around it, it sort of creates this false narrative of Israel and utilizes it as that it is the all-powerful force within the Middle East. And then you look at a map. Basically, from the Atlantic all the way to Asia, and you see this one tiny little blue dot in a sea of red. And you recognize that throughout history, Jews have been interspersed throughout the entire area. And you understand that it's not the control of that one little blue dot, but the survival of that one little blue dot. But for so many, especially young people, there's a complete lack of history. There is a complete lack of understanding of what and how Israel was created. And that narrative is created by their online presence on TikTok and on other social media forums. And there's no filter to be able to say what is true and what isn't. And, I get angry about it. And I get angry about how both sides in American politics have become so extreme that nothing is able to get done. But then I realized that when I was growing up and I was their age, I was looking at people like Ted Kennedy working with Bob Dole across the aisle in order to be able to create the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they've never seen that. They've never even thought of it. It's out of their perception, and they're being fed this other idea that we must conquer. So when going through that filter of their mind and being given only one side of a story, what scares me the most is that not only will that affect the relationships of American youth with Israel, but American youth with everything.
Thank you. I want to build on that answer and the topic that you talked about. Now we're seeing this development and the political polarization also happening with political leaders. And then American Jewish Congress president spoke about this in his opening remarks, mentioning about that sometimes this hate discourse is being encouraged by politicians. And we see that also in the municipality level, in the city races. About like different in different politicians, this different discourse that is promoting or addressing hate or protecting vulnerable communities. Does this process concerns you? And in your view, can the Jewish community in America today truly feel safe?
Address the second part first. No. I live in a predominantly Jewish community in Point Breeze, which is right next to Squirrel Hill. I worry about friends. My former chief of staff is one of my best friends. I worry about his children as they grow up and how he will have to address things that other parents won't ever have to consider. I have Jewish friends who tell me that when a door opens during services in the back, how they immediately turn their head and think the worst. I mean, that's not a way to live your life, not in America. And nobody had to do so under these types of stressful situations in the past. My family is, all four of my grandparents are Italian, and my grandfather came over in 1921, and he settled in a little town called Carnegie. And in 1923, the Ku Klux Klan came to Carnegie, 10,000 strong, and it was in protest against the Southern and Eastern Europeans, the Catholics and the Jews. And it was also against the Irish Catholics, who had basically become predominant within the Protestant community. And they burned a 70-foot cross, and they recruited 1,000 new members. And then they marched into the town. And my grandfather was there with the other immigrants. And they stood at the Glendale Bridge with pieces of picket fence and pipes and baseball bats and knives. And they said no. And they stopped the Klan at the bridge, and from the church tower of St. Luke's, the Irish Catholic Church, where they were going to burn another 70-foot cross, a person shot and killed one of the Klan leaders, and they retreated. And my grandfather would tell me that story again and again when I was a child, but what I didn't realize was it was 1 year later, 1924, the United States Congress passed a bill on immigration that would limit the amount of Italians and Jews and Slovaks and Poles to the numbers that they were in 1890. And it was because of that act that boats were turned away as they tried to come from Germany to the United States in the 1930s. And it was because of that act that my grandfather had to wait 5 years for my grandmother to be able to come to America. And as we see this, and we know that that was part of our history, we have to recognize where we are today and to be able to say that history repeats itself. And unless we are proactive and start taking actions against those that are trying to bring us back to those types of days, we will repeat history.
Thank you, Mayor Peduto. And now, before we conclude, one last question for you. You joined the American Jewish Congress International Mayors Conference in 2019, just months after the Tree of Life attack. Could you share with us a few memories or reflections from that experience and what it meant for you to stand in solidarity with mayors from around the world and with Israel, especially as now we prepare for our next International Mayors Conference, which is coming up in November 16 in Israel?
So I not only shared that experience, but I was able to share it with two of my very long time closest friends, Steve Irwin and Jeff Zell, both civic and business leaders of Pittsburgh, who met, ironically, on a trip that they took together to Israel. And I got to view the entire experience, not only through my own eyes, but through theirs. There was a moment when I was taken away from the rest of the group as they were doing a tour of Jerusalem to be able to visit the 9/11 site. And while I was there, they took me to the side where the Tree of Life site was created, and the names of our neighbors are etched in stone. And Steve was also invited, but he came late, and he joined me. And I had the opportunity to walk him over to that site, and neither of us knew that it existed. And he looked down and he saw the names, and it hit him. And he just gasped, put his hand over his mouth, and began to cry. And that connection between Israel and Pittsburgh became so very, very real in that one moment. The opportunities that were given to us to be able to visit not only institutions of Israeli culture, but also cutting edge innovation that was coming out of that country, was something that helped me as a mayor to understand what type of innovation was possible in my own city. We had that time together in a way to bond, but the one thing that really I'll never forget was there was a large group of mayors from around the world. And whenever we were with a group of Israelis, as they would go through the introductions and say the name and then say the city, whenever it was my turn, and they'd say William Peduto, Mayor of Pittsburgh, that same gasp that Steve had at that moment of recognition was audible. And I asked somebody about it, and their answer was persecution within Judaism has been around for over 5,000 years. We're used to it. What we're not used to is when an entire community stands with us. And I have never been more proud to be a Pittsburgher.
Thank you, Mayor Peduto, for these powerful and important words, for sharing your story with us tonight. Thank you very much for that. And I want to thank you as well for your leadership, both during one of the most painful chapters in American Jewish history and throughout your years of public service. Thank you so much for being with us today.